Hello and welcome once again to Bible Class Topics. We're continuing our study of the Gospel of Matthew. Today we'll begin chapter 19, part 1 of 2 parts. Here's the overall outline of our study. Jesus Christ, the King of the House of David. We're in the third section entitled Facing Rejection. In that section, we're talking about the third section, questions, discourses, and parables of judgment. This will continue to the end of chapter 25. In Matthew 19, we've divided the study into 2 parts. Part 1, verses 1 through 12, Jewish marriage and divorce, Jewish grounds of divorce, the answer of Jesus, the high ideal, the realization of the ideal, and marriage and divorce. We'll continue in part 2 with the rest of the chapter. Before we get going too far into the notes, let's get our Bibles out and take a look at the first 9 verses of chapter 19. Reading, as usual, in this study from the English Standard Version. Now when Jesus had finished these sayings, he went away from Galilee and entered the region of Judea beyond the Jordan, and large crowds followed him, and he healed them there. And Pharisees came up to him and tested him by asking, "Is it lawful to divorce one's wife for any cause?" He answered them, "Have you not read that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female, and said, 'Therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh'? So they are no longer two, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let not man separate." They said to him, "Why then did Moses command one to give a certificate of divorce and to send her away?" He said to them, "Because of your hardness of heart, Moses allowed you to divorce your wives, but from the beginning it was not so. And I say to you, whoever divorces his wife, except for sexual immorality, and marries another, commits adultery." Well, there's a lot to talk about here. And as usual, when we discuss Matthew chapter 19, we will probably raise more questions than we answer. And I apologize for that in advance, but let's see what we can do with these 9 verses. The question of divorce and remarriage was debated among the sects of the Jews. The Jews held marriage in higher regard than any of the surrounding nations. Jews were expected to be married and producing children by the age of 20, except those men who decided to devote themselves to the study of the law. Marriage was not to be entered into lightly or carelessly. Let me read a little something from Barclay's commentary as he quotes Josephus, the first century Jewish historian. "A man must marry a virgin of good parentage. He must never corrupt another man's wife, and he must not marry a woman who had been a slave or a harlot. If a man accuse his wife of not being a virgin when he married her, he must bring proofs of his accusation. Her father or brother must defend her. If the girl was vindicated, he must take her in marriage, and could never again put her away except for the most flagrant sin. If the accusation was proved to have been reckless and malicious, the man who made it must be beaten with 40 stripes save one, and must pay 50 shekels to the girl's father. But if the charge was proved and the girl was found guilty, if she was one of the ordinary people, the law was that she must be stoned to death, and if she was the daughter of the priest, she must be burned alive. If a man seduced a girl who was espoused to be married, and the seduction took place with her consent, both he and she must be put to death. If in a lonely place or where there was no help present, the man forced the girl into sin, the man alone was put to death. If a man seduced an unespoused girl, he must marry her, or if her father was unwilling for him to marry her, he must pay the father 50 shekels. This is the kind of teaching that the Jews of Jesus' time were used to. Ideally, the Jews would then hate divorce. Malachi 2:16 tells us that God hates divorce. But in practice, divorce did occur. You can tell from this reading of Josephus that under Jewish law, a woman was a thing. She was first her father's possession, then her husband's. Under Moses, the man could initiate a divorce without the wife's consent, but the wife could only obtain a divorce with the husband's consent. There were certain safeguards. If the divorce was not for immorality, the dowry must be returned. Courts might pressure the husband to divorce if he was not taking proper care of the wife or refused to consummate the marriage. Finally, a wife could initiate the divorce if he contracted certain incurable diseases, if he became a tanner, or if he tried to remove her from Palestine. I'm not sure why becoming a tanner would cause the right for divorce, but I suspect it's the fact that the tanner was almost 24/7 ceremonially unclean because of his work. Deuteronomy 24:1 is where Moses gives his ruling that divorce could take place, and it was easy for a man to obtain a divorce. Usually a one-sentence statement putting her away would suffice. Remember, unless the woman was a notorious sinner, the dowry must be returned to her father. Well, what is this indecency that Moses spoke of in Deuteronomy? What did the rabbis say? Well, Shammai said that the indecency was only fornication. This is what Jesus repeats here in our reading. However, the more liberal of the rabbis, such as Hillel and Akiba, would tell you that it was for any reason or perhaps for no reason. Let me read a couple of quotes from them, taken from Barclay's commentary. Starting with Hillel and his school, they said that the matter of indecency meant that a man could divorce his wife if she spoiled his dinner, if she spun or went with unbound hair or spoke to men in the streets, if she spoke disrespectfully of his parents in his presence, if she was a brawling woman whose voice could be heard next door. Meanwhile, Rabbi Akiba even went the length of saying that the phrase, if she finds no favor in his eyes, meant that a man could divorce his wife if he found a woman whom he liked better and considered more beautiful. That sounds like some of the modern day reasons people get divorced. There were two reasons, however, that demanded a divorce: adultery and sterility. And this was determined after 10 years of marriage with still no children. Desertion, however, was never a cause for divorce, but it only took one witness to prove that the spouse was dead instead of the usual 2 or 3 witnesses. Once the witness said the spouse was dead, then of course the marriage was broken. Insanity, however, was not a reason for divorce, and this was a mercy for the wife, because if she was insane, no one would ever take her in, and it would be impossible for the insane husband to divorce because he was the one who must write the bill of divorcement. When Jesus answers this question, no one from either schools of the rabbis will be left unsurprised. Even the conservative school of Shammai is still going to be surprised. And of course, the liberal schools such as Hillel and Akiba will be surprised. Why? Because as usual, he proposes radical change. The Pharisees were trying to involve Jesus in the controversy between the two schools. Jesus takes his questioners back to the beginning. Was divorce a choice for Adam and Eve? The Pharisees think they have Jesus right where they want him because he just contradicted Moses. Unfortunately for the Pharisees, what they don't understand and what they never understand is what Moses said was not a law. It was a concession. And he never commanded divorce, but he permitted it to regulate a certain situation. And that certain situation, according to Jesus, was because of the hardness of their hearts. Now I'm going to turn to Chumbley's commentary and read a few things to you. Due to sinful human obstinacy, a practice was allowed under the law of Moses that differed from God's original design. Why God made this concession to human Why God made this concession to human wickedness isn't easy to determine. Most likely he did so to protect the innocent. In ancient society, life could be extremely hard for a single woman, and you can look at Ruth chapter 1 to see that. Allowing divorced wives to remarry protected them against economic deprivation and degrading situations caused by their wicked husbands. Then Chumbley talks about some things he found while reading Harold Fowler's commentary. How could God or Moses tolerate such hardness of heart? On the basis of genuine compassion for the women, the true victims of that bad situation. An entire nation cannot be instantly raised from moral vileness to Christian standards merely by enacting better laws. Forced by law to keep an unloved, unwanted wife, the brutal husband could abuse her with beatings, starvations, humiliations, and overwork. Thus, even permitting her to be sent away with the formal protection of the divorce certificate would in this case been a real kindness to her. So the situation in the time of Moses caused him to make this concession. However, Genesis 2:23 and 24 is the ideal marriage. This is what God meant marriage to be. As some people shorten it, he meant marriage to be a leaving and a cleaving. It's interesting when we read the exception, except for fornication, that Matthew is the only one to report this. In Mark 10:11 and 12, Luke 16:18, neither of them mention it. However, Mark does report that a woman could initiate a divorce. So that's something new under Christ's law. Under Jewish law, adultery made divorce compulsory. So perhaps Mark and Luke chose, as directed by the Holy Spirit, to not include the exception clause. Meanwhile, why did Matthew decide to include the exception clause? Well, scholars say Matthew wrote after Mark and Luke, and it's very possible that the people he was going to originally deliver his gospel to were caught up in the throes of arguments concerning divorce and remarriage. But no matter what we say and what we do, whatever Mark and Luke report, when Matthew reports the words of Christ here in this chapter, it's obvious that Jesus is saying an ideal marriage is a union that cannot be broken. I want to read a couple more things on this from Chumbley before we carry on. Note that Christ says what God has joined together, not whom. It isn't individual marriages Jesus primarily has in mind, but God's action in uniting husbands and wives in the marriage relationship at creation. The word joined together, which means yoked together or united, and it's only found here or in Mark chapter 10, verse 9. This word joined together underscores the fact that it is God who makes a marriage, and that what he has done is not to be undone by man. This should be a sober warning to anyone who brings a marriage to an end or encourages such. The answer Christ gives the Pharisees' question of verse 3, therefore, is an unequivocal no. A man cannot divorce his wife for every and any cause. The Hebrew word for marriage means consecration and sanctification means dedicated to God. This is what Jesus meant when he said, leave father and mother and cleave to each other as one flesh. Well, what does this one flesh actually imply? Not that any one thing will be done together, but that all things will be done as one. That's firstly. And secondly, marriage is the total union of two personalities, not one dominant and the other subservient, not a camp of armed neutrality where there is continuous tension, opposition, and collision of wishes, not a resigned acceptance, and not sharing a house without sharing a home. Sometimes it's easier to see what something is by looking at what it is not. So ideally, the two personalities should work in concert toward one goal. Marriage should not narrow our lives. It should expand and complete our lives. It should bring a new fullness. It should bring a new satisfaction. It should bring a new contentment. And of course, there will be adjustments and sacrifices, but in the long haul, marriage brings things to a person's life that singleness cannot supply. Marriage must be a sharing of all of life's circumstances. The early days of courtship present a certain danger. What are these dangers? Well, the main danger is in the early days of courtship, everyone, both parties, are generally putting their best feet forward. In marriage, we see each other far from our best. The couple must be prepared to face the routine of life as a team. Well, that makes me wonder, in our day and age when we aren't expected necessarily by the age of 20 to be married and producing children, can a marriage be pursued too quickly? Do we really know all we need to know before we tie the knot? Of course, this is the argument we get into with people who want to live together outside of marriage. They want to take their marriage on a test run before they actually commit to the paper. The Bible won't accept this. It's nowhere taught as being proper anywhere in the Old or New Testament. But perhaps we need to practice longer engagements. Perhaps we need to be more thorough in our examination of not only our potential spouse, but our potential spouse's background, family, and past lives. The basis then of marriage is togetherness. The basis of togetherness is considerateness. The him and her thinking has to be eclipsed by us thinking. And the surest way to destroy any personal relationship is through selfishness. Turning back to Barclay, I want to read two things. First, a story from Somerset Maugham. He tells of his mother. She was lovely and charming and beloved by all. His father was not by any means handsome and had few social and surface gifts and graces. Someone said to his mother, "When everyone is in love with you, and when you could have had anyone you liked, how can you remain faithful to that ugly little man you married?" And she answered simply, "He never hurts my feelings." There could be no finer tribute to a husband, or to a wife for that matter. Barclay continues, the true basis of marriage is not complicated and recondite. It is simply the love which thinks more of the happiness of others than it thinks of its own. The love which is proud to serve, which is able to understand, and therefore always able to forgive. That is to say, it is Christ-like love. Christ-like love which knows that in forgetting self, it will find self, and that in losing itself, it will this way complete itself. I think Barclay's hit the nail on the head and pounded it home. A few more things to say on verse 9 before we leave this section entitled The High Ideal. Number one, anyone who divorces their spouse and remarries commits adultery. You can also see chapter 5, verse 32, which we discussed during our study of the Sermon on the Mount. Anyone who divorces their spouse for the cause of fornication can remarry. And anyone who marries someone divorced for any reason other than adultery commits adultery. That makes us understand that as far as the Bible is concerned, marriage can exist on two levels, the lawful and the legal. This is something that I've come to understand here in our state. We have the so-called no-fault divorce laws, which means you cannot put anything on the divorce papers for a reason. The judge just rules that the marriage is unretrievably broken. Virtually every Christian recognizes the distinction between lawful and legal. In the case of the no-fault states, where divorce for fornication is not allowed to be put on the document, most brethren believe that in such a state a person can get a lawful divorce for fornication even though they can't get a legal divorce for fornication. We have to understand man can make laws, but man cannot circumvent God's laws with his laws. Continue, we need to read a few more verses, and that's verses 10, 11, and 12. So, here we go. The disciples said to him, "If such is the case of a man with his wife, it's better not to marry." But he said to them, "Not everyone can receive this saying, but only those to whom it is given. For there are eunuchs who have been so from birth, and there are eunuchs who have been made eunuchs by men, and there are eunuchs who have made themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. Let the one who is able to receive this, receive this." The disciples were as surprised as the Pharisees by Jesus' teaching. Why? Well, there's a certain rabbi who taught if a man has a bad wife, it was his religious duty to divorce her. They had been raised in the divorce for any reason time of Judaism. What then is the escape route from an evil situation according to Jesus? Well, first of all, you have to understand that only a Christian can accept the Christian ethic. Without the help of Jesus and the Holy Spirit through the whole counsel of God, can a person do what needs to be done to make their marriage work? It is impossible to live out the teachings of Jesus without Jesus. Therefore, Christian marriages generally require two Christians to make it work. If it can't work, it's possible that you may have to live single the rest of your life. There are three types of eunuchs, he says: born that way, made that way, and those that choose to be that way. Does he mean this literally? Well, of course, in some cases he does mean it literally, but what about figuratively? Can you choose to be what we usually call celibate? And can a Christian choose to remain celibate for Christ's sake? Are there situations where it is better or even lawful to remain unmarried? Why did Paul the Apostle himself remain single? I don't know that he ever totally tells us exactly why, but in 1 Corinthians chapter 7 and verse 7, he says, I wish that all were as myself, but each has his own gift from God, one of one kind and one of another kind. He said his ability to remain celibate, as far as what he was concerned, was a gift from God. And the gift, he's saying, is because he was able to do his job better without being married. Marriage is a permanent union only to be broken by death or sexual sin. That's what we've learned in these first 12 verses. Only God can break that union. In New Testament, getting the divorce is what breaks the union. In the Old Testament, death was what broke the union, if the marriage was to be annulled for sexual sin. Well, how therefore can the innocent party remarry? Christ is making new laws here, but his marriage law was based on three previous laws of God. First, the Garden of Eden. Only God could break the union. Second, the Ten Commandments. Sexual sin would break a marriage union. And then, the further writings of Moses, God could ordain divorce and free the innocent party to remarry. To divorce and remarry, though, for any other reason, as we've already stated, is adultery. Now, did Jesus teach that the offended mate had to get a divorce? Remember, in the old law, for sexual sin, divorce wasn't really an option because the guilty party would be stoned to death. But here's the thing. Jesus is not teaching the offended mate had to get a divorce, because divorce is the final option, not the first option. Let's repeat a few things. A happy marriage is built on commitment, love, mutual understanding, sacrifice, and hard work. A happy marriage will not happen by accident. It's interesting that Jesus then immediately moves back to a discussion of the children. To find out why he does that, you'll have to join me again when we take up our second part of chapter 19 as we study verses 13 through 30. Until then, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell, leave me a comment. I'm sure there might be some about a lesson as tricky as this one. Keep me in your prayers. I'll keep you in mind. Until the next time we meet, may God bless.